The dust hadn't even settled when she dropped to her knees beside him. 23 years old. 3 years into a war that had already taken pieces of her she'd never get back. Her hands were shaking, but they didn't stop moving. Around her, the world was screaming, gunfire, radios, men shouting coordinates into the dark. But all she could hear was the wet, ragged sound of a 20-year-old Marine trying to breathe through a hole in his chest that shouldn't have let him breathe at all. She'd used her last clean bandage 20 minutes earlier on another boy 3 trucks back. This one, she had nothing left for. So, she did the only thing she could. She pulled off her own field jacket, pressed it into the wound, and leaned her full weight onto a stranger's chest, counting his pulse against her palm like it was the only number that had ever mattered. "Stay with me," she kept saying. "Stay with me. You don't get to do this here." He didn't know her name. He never got the chance to ask. By the time the medevac came screaming in, he'd already slipped under, and the last thing he remembered before the blackness was a pair of eyes. Green, he thought, though he could never be sure, and a voice that refused to let him go. He woke up 4 days later in a hospital bed 2,000 miles from where he'd nearly died, and the first thing he asked the nurse wasn't where he was. It was who had saved him. Nobody knew. There were 100 medics in that sector that week. Records were chaos. Half the paperwork from that night had been lost in the scramble to keep more men alive. The hospital staff gave him a shrug and a "we'll look into it" that quietly became nothing. So he carried her instead. For years, he went home, he got married. He had 2 kids, and a job, and a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like it was supposed to. But there was a scar on his chest that itched on certain humid nights, and every time it did, he thought about a woman whose face he could barely remember and whose name he never knew. He started small. A letter to the VA asking about medics deployed to that region during that week. A forum post in a veterans group, vague and probably hopeless. Years passed. The forum post sat there, untouched, gathering dust the way old grief does, not gone, just quiet. Then, 11 years after that night, a comment appeared underneath it. A woman, now in her 30s, said she'd been a combat medic in that same sector, that same week. She remembered a young Marine with a chest wound and a borrowed jacket pressed against it. She remembered counting his pulse out loud because she was terrified that if she stopped counting, he'd stop too. He read it standing in his kitchen at 11 at night, and he had to sit down on the floor. They talked for hours over the phone before they ever met in person. She told him things he'd never known, that she'd left the service not long after, that the weight of that week had followed her home in ways she still hadn't fully put down. He told her about his kids, his job, the scar, the itch on humid nights. Neither of them said much about the moment itself. They didn't need to. It was the one thing they'd both been carrying without knowing the other person existed. When they finally met, a parking lot outside a diner in a town that meant nothing to either of them, except that it was roughly halfway, he didn't say anything clever. He'd rehearsed it for years, a speech with all the right words in it, and the second he saw her, every word left him. He just walked up and hugged her like he'd known her his whole life. In a way, he had. She just hadn't known it. She cried first. He cried harder. "You used your last bandage on me," he said, finally, his voice breaking. "I found out later. You had nothing left, and you still gave it to me." She shook her head, like that part had never mattered to her. "I wasn't going to let you be the one I lost that day," she said. "I'd already lost one. I wasn't losing 2. He spent years searching for a stranger so he could say 2 words to her. Thank you. But standing in that parking lot, he realized those 2 words weren't enough, and they both knew it. And somehow that was exactly enough anyway. They still talk every week. He calls her his sister now, and means it. And every year, on the anniversary of that night, she gets a text from him that says the same thing it always says. Still here. Still grateful. Still yours to thank.